distinguished experts to speak with us today about a key relationship within the broader Middle East that has been deteriorating quite constantly over the last 10 months. The Middle East Institute has been covering the regional implications of the war in Gaza through multiple channels and avenue publications and events. We also put an effort to look how the war impacts Israel's regional relations. We did webinars on Israel-Egypt relations. We looked at Israel-Saudi relations. Today we look at Israel-Turkey relations. This relationship has been going on since 1949. The two countries have been enjoying consecutive diplomatic ties that have proven to be resilient in the face of multiple crises, with Turkey being the first Muslim country to recognize Israel. Relations has lots of ups and downs during the decades, with a lot of changing balance between public elements and secret elements, between years in which the relationship was focused mostly on security cooperation, to years in which economic and civilian affairs were more at the forefront. Many of the crises and the challenges were related to the Palestinian issue, to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. At years when there was progress towards a two-state solution, Israel-Turkey relations flourished, and whenever there were problems, especially around Gaza and around Jerusalem, we saw tensions coming to the forefront between Israel and Turkey, and we all remember the flotilla incidents of 2010 as a major event in that sequence. We did see the two countries, even when they had kind of hawkish leadership, managed to find a way to eventually reconcile or do some rapprochement, both in 2016, later in 2021, 2022. But those were kind of short-lived events and didn't stick. And whenever October 7 happened, and after the Hamas terror attack, and after some opening conditions that put Turkey in a unique place where it could have played more of a constructive role, having good ties with Egypt at the time, having good ties with Israel. Erdogan and Netanyahu just met just shortly before October 7th. Erdogan was calling Israeli President Herzog on October 7th, being one of the only region leaders to do so. But since then, things have been going in a negative direction, with the crisis between the countries keeping on escalating, perhaps leading us to one of the worst places in this history of bilateral relationship. Today, we'll be trying to understand what is really the damage that has been caused to this relationship over the last few months, and is there a way out? Could we reverse the negative trends in ties? And if so, which are the conditions to do that? Who are the actors that could play an important role in that? And what should they do? We'll also be looking at the role of the United States, given the centrality of the US to this relationship in the past. And we'll keep in mind that the relationship between countries are not limited only to their leaders and governments. What happens in diplomacy over the last decade is that civil society, private sector, entrepreneurs all have a major role in shaping relationship. So even if the leaders of those countries do not get along very well, there is still space for others to play a role. And within today's speakers in the group, we have people who have spent years and even decades trying to foster unofficial relations between Israel and Turkey and make them better. So we'll also benefit from that knowledge. Our speakers today are first Ambassador David Satterfield, the director of the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University and a former American ambassador to Turkey. My colleague at the Middle East Institute, Dr. Gunul Tul, was the director of the Turkey program. Dr. Galia Lindenstrauss, senior research fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv. Dr. Arad Nir, head of the Foreign News Desk at Israel's Channel 12 News. And Professor Sol Yozel, a senior lecturer of international relations at Kader Has University. We'll do this webinar in a conversation style in which we'll cover first the American dimension, then we will look into domestic issues within both of our countries, and finally we'll look at the regional international perspective and how that impacts, taking also into account what happens in the war in Gaza and its impact. Those of you having questions as we speak, you can put them in the chat, and we'll try with the limited time that we have to cover as many of those. And I want to thank the staff at the Middle East Institute and Gunul for helping this event come to life, and I wish you an enjoyable discussion and conversation. Ambassador Satterfield, if I may, I would like to begin with you. Israel and Turkey are long-standing American allies, and we see their ties, as I mentioned, deteriorating since October 7th. They're at a low point, and in previous instances in which that happened, we saw the US administration pitch in and try to help improve the relations between them. So first, how is this crisis between two American allies currently seen by American policy circles? What do you see the US trying to do in order to contain the crisis, maybe somehow soften whatever is happening? And could the US do more than that as it tries to pave ways for both countries to somehow manage and improve the relationship? And you are still on mute, Ambassador.
Sorry. Now, first and foremost, the quality, the character of the bilateral relationship between Turkey and Israel is important and important strategically to the United States. We want to see those relations develop and be sustained in as positive a fashion as possible. But at the end of the day, it is not so much the US role in the past or currently that is going to shape the quality of those ties. It is very much the personal attitude and positions taken by the two leaders, but particularly President Erdogan. We've been through very, very difficult periods in that relationship in the past. You referenced the fallout from the Mavi Marmara ship affair. There have been others. The famous Davos touch on the shoulder, which produced an even further chill in the relationship. But at the end of the day, and I don't want to appear to you or the audience to be too sanguine about this, at the end of the day, there are fundamental engines that drive Turkey and Israel toward a relationship, not away from a relationship. They are economic. Both countries play a not insignificant role in the economies of the other. Not irreplaceable, but important. Tourism, foreign currency is extremely important to Turkey. Israeli tourists, Israeli currency for goods purchased, particularly construction materials from Turkey, all of that play a role. And then there is the Eastern Med and hydrocarbons. Erdogan has always seen one of the fundamental pillars of the relationship being the potential for Turkey serving as a landing point, a receiving point for gas from offshore Israeli and other platforms. And so these have driven him over the years back to a better relationship, not away. But he is admittedly an emotional leader. He views himself as the leader of the world's Muslims. Whether the world's Muslims reciprocate is a different story. But for Erdogan, taking a position, even at expense to the Turkish economy, is important in a crisis like this, where his self-proclaimed role as defender of the Palestinians, if you want to elaborate on that, he would say a better defender than the so-called states, former Ottoman possessions, which have betrayed or abandoned the Palestinian cause. So you have this emotional element in Erdogan's policy contrasted with rational, pragmatic, and much calmer strategic approaches, which Erdogan has also articulated. What do we do as the United States? We continue to maintain the best relationship we can have with Turkey. We support publicly and privately when Turkey takes positive steps, as it has, with respect to regional issues. And we hope for and anticipate better times in the future. But I don't want to ascribe to the US a decisive role in this, not now and not in the past.
Thank you. That's important, especially that Israel and Turkey do have this history of bilateral relations and good engagement, so they have the channels that could help steer things through. But still, I think the US, we look at the US as an important actor, and you've been based in Ankara recently at quite an interesting period of time in Israel-Turkey relations, in which the two countries try to find a way over the last 2 or 3 years to move beyond their crisis. And whatever your involvement, if it was on the ground relevant to that process, you still observed an interesting bilateral diplomatic process between American allies. What were the lessons that you learned from seeing this evolve, seeing this happen, to what both countries can do in the future? What were the key success of that we can take into account as we continue our conversation?
Okay, Nimrod, what I took away from that experience is that At the end of the day, President Erdogan looks to the context in which he holds power, and it is a context shaped critically by Turkish economics. Erdogan will not maintain a policy, has not maintained policies in the past, which fundamentally threaten Turkey's very fragile economy. He has pivoted repeatedly, most notably after the recent presidential election, on interest rate policies. The Central Bank of Turkey is now an orthodox mainstream policy institute, in contrast to preceding years. That was driven by Erdogan's understanding the economy must be stable for his rule to be stable. To the extent that Israel and the United States and Israel's projection more broadly in the region and in the US are seen by Erdogan as important to stabilizing the economy and creating a favorable view of Turkey, he will take the necessary steps. There are outbursts. You will all recall when he accused President Biden of having blood on his hands, and Israel in a blood libel of not being satisfied unless it could drink blood. These outbursts produced significant damage, but they were overcome in time as Erdogan pivoted back to a more mainstream course. It's the role of the US, Europe, Israel itself, to try to not conflict with the readjustment back to normalcy, to allow a pathway, encourage a pathway back. And I do believe there will be a pathway back as the Gaza situation, we hope, ultimately calms itself, because there are imperatives that are socioeconomic and domestic for President Erdogan in all of this.
Thank you. And finally, you mentioned Gaza. You were also responsible for humanitarian issue related to the war in Gaza. And we know this is an issue that was important for Turkey in the past, and that American officials that were visiting the region in the last few months were also stopping by Ankara to talk with the Turks about it. What role do you see Turkey could have in shaping a day after reality in the Gaza Strip?
We certainly hope that to the extent Turkey does have effective contacts with ability to message Hamas, that it uses those channels in as positive a direction as possible. And indeed, in those conversations, we certainly see Turkey as supportive of the idea of a ceasefire. But the contacts with Hamas run primarily through Qatar and through Egypt, not through Istanbul or Ankara.
Thank you, Ambassador Satterfield. We're moving on to the domestic aspects. And for that, I will speak with Professor Sol Yozel and with Arad Nir. And you already mentioned, Ambassador, the importance of leaders. You mentioned Erdogan multiple times, and we definitely see, at least in the public diplomacy side of things, the quarrels between Erdogan and Netanyahu getting a lot of public visibility and shaping also public opinion. So the first question I would like to ask both of you, and Professor Yozel, perhaps you could start us first, is how do you assess the policies of Erdogan, or maybe also Netanyahu, towards the other country? You know, what drives that policy, that attitude, the public rhetoric? How much damage did that really cause to the bilateral relations, and how much of that is sinking into the public opinion? Because for years we've been hearing about a solid base, at least, of people who have had positive experience with each other that do not easily follow the leader's rhetoric. So how does that all look today?
It's very difficult for me to gauge what the Israelis now think about Turkey. Correspondence with friends suggests that in this particular case, and I'll get to the way we see this case, the Gaza thing, that pronouncements in Turkey are damaging the mood among the Israeli public much more than previous crises, which I guess is understandable because this war has dragged on for nearly 10 months now. and the bloodshed is truly awful, and everybody's watching what goes on, if you will, on their television screens. And then, of course, social media is full of messages and videos and news and all that. Okay, on the Turkish side. But now it is important to note that if Bibi Netanyahu and Tayyip Erdogan do not really have much love lost for one another mutually, but they did meet in September, and I think the Prime Minister of Israel was scheduled to come to Turkey in December last year. And then, of course, the October 7 assault has taken place, and then, of course, the war ensued. And at first, President Erdogan did take a position that was calm, measured, and tried to position Turkey as a mediator, as a guarantor of a peaceful approach, maybe for a ceasefire and stuff. That really didn't last long, and by the end of the month, by the end of October, right before the Republic Day in Turkey, with responding to pressures from the populations, from his base, and certainly from his very strong adversary among the Islamist camp, the new Welfare Party, he began to toughen his rhetoric. And I think as both the rhetoric escalated and the measures that were taken against Israel have become more serious, the impact of YRP's ability to undermine Erdogan played an important role. It is not really surprising that the trade embargoes, the lifting of THY flights, and other measures have come after Mr. Erdogan got really the worst defeat of his political life in the municipal elections that took place on the 31st of March, 2024, when he lost a lot of his supporters to the new Welfare Party, run by the godfather of Turkish Islamist movement, Mr. Necmettin Erbakan. His son Fatih Erbakan has actually taken the mantle. But it is not just the Islamist camp that is incensed. I mean, I think the way you look at these things from a country like Turkey and the way you look at these things from a country like the United States in terms of public's visions and assessments of what's going on are radically different. It's very difficult for the Turkish public to accept the way the American public can be persuaded to rationalize what goes on and the kind of support that the United States provides to Israel, again, going into the 10th month with the last bunch of $22 billion package for weapons and stuff. That is very difficult for the Turkish public, leftist, Islamist, liberals, whatever, to truly accept. So the pressure came not just from the Islamist camp, although politically that was probably most telling, but also from all others. On the other hand, the government has not really refrained from beating up young conservative or Islamist protesters when they went on the streets. The police attacked them, which is unprecedented in this government's record, if you will. It's usually for the leftists that the police use quite a lot of violence. So the rhetoric got radicalized, and trade presumably was cut first partially and then fully. But just 2 weeks ago, former Ambassador Selim Kunerar actually gave us some figures whereby trade with the Palestinian Authority in cement went up by, this is not me making it up, 453,680%. Not to mention, the trade via Greece and maybe other third countries. And the question today is whether or not there will be enough pressure, or even there is a lot more pressure, the government would be willing to keep companies from sending material goods to Israel via third parties. Secondly, And of course, this has to do with the contracts that the Turkish side has signed. The oil from Azerbaijan goes through Baku Ceyhan to Israel. Shipping continues to go through the straits and all that. So in a way, except for the THY suspension of flights, by the way, probably that was one of the most profitable lines that the THY had. The trade thing appears to be much less than what is being propagated to the public. And from the left, there is, of course, always a cry to close down the Kurecik radar installment. And there was an outcry now that the Turkish ships participated in a naval exercise on the Mediterranean with American ships. There was really no, and by the way, the Turkish side did not really announce this. We had to learn it from I think from the American authorities announcements on their websites. So there is a lot of turbulence, there is a lot of hype, but in a way, somehow things have not calmed down, but have stabilized, unless, the Israeli foreign minister Katz decides to provoke a response from his counterparts in Turkey. And then there is, of course, a good tit for tat. At times, something that incensed the Azeris as well, when Mr. Erdogan talked about what Turkey could do, as it had done in Libya and in Karabakh, whether or not whether it could do the same in Israel. This was more a coffee shop talk with his local party organization. I'm not sure how seriously that should have been taken. But at the rhetorical level, obviously, it's very difficult to figure out how the two sides are going to reconcile. And that brings me to the second part of your question, that is, really, what would be a turning point, if there ever can be a turning point? And when I look at that, I guess what will be much more, what will be very important will be for Turkey not to be left out of the reconstruction process in Gaza. Ambassador Satterfield said that there are many forces that actually drive the two countries to cooperate strategically, and that has always been the modus operandi since the beginning of times, even when there were very serious crises. And a friend of mine is now looking at the archives in Britain and see how, for instance, after the Suez War, there were a lot of tensions between the two countries, not to mention all the recent ones that the ambassador has also alluded to. So that strategic imperative, in spite of public opinion, still operates, and I think Mr. Erdogan does recognize it. So long as Turkey is not going to be left out of the reconstruction of Gaza, there will be an opportunity to start building the relations again. Whether the publics will go along with it is the big question. This war, unlike the other ones, first of all, it lasted far too long, and it has not yet ended, has probably done more damage to the public's views globally about Israel and the way the Israeli politics works. And it may take a lot longer to actually repair those relations. And I'm afraid, Mr. Ambassador, tourism is not going to kick off anytime soon in the relations between the two countries. Trade is a different matter, particularly given Turkey's economic conditions today.
Thank you. Arad, would you like to take that from an Israeli perspective?
You mute. Arad, you're mute.
I can follow up, sorry, with a short question to you before Arad joined us in that.
He's on mute. Okay.
Yeah, so let me follow up with you for a second, because you mentioned the conditions that are needed in order to make a change. And when you look at the domestic scene in Turkey with the different actors, official and unofficial, what are the pillars? Where do you see some places in which there is still support for better relation with Israel? There is still willingness to take some action. Where does the hope come from? And what are the tangible benefits of better relation between the countries that those supporting that could advocate for?
One thing I did leave out, and there are some figures for that, but I'm not really confident that they necessarily reflect the reality. This government is far too pro-Hamas for the Turkish public in general. And there were some reports, or at least some surveys, that suggested that the country does not look at being pro-Hamas the way it looks at being pro-Palestinian. So in that sense, there is a separation, and there is criticism of the government for being so pro-Hamas. In that sense, I guess the maybe reluctant visit of Mahmoud Abbas and his speech at the National Assembly, and I mean, many people made a lot of comments about that speech, but what struck me was his insistence, and I think in that National Assembly, given the fact who his hosts were, his insistence that there was only one legitimate Palestinian government, and that was the Palestinian Authority, and he would go to Gaza as the head of Palestinian Authority, which actually encompassed the governance of Gaza as well. So if relations with, now that Turkey lost Haniyeh, and I don't think Sinwar does have much communication with Turkey, he's more the Iran man. Maybe Turkey will be paying much more attention to the Palestinian Authority, which leaves a lot to write home about. But and through that, it may bring itself to at least enter the game until a ceasefire is established, if it is established. And from then on, it will try to present itself both as a protector of that ceasefire, and second, as certainly a willing participant in the reconstruction of Gaza. And then if there are Gazan or Hamas political agents that Turkey had already had contact with, maybe it will use its good offices to actually build something between the PA and them so that they could be presented politically to the rest of the world as well.
Thank you very much, Soli. Arad, I'm going to you. And you can try and combine the different questions that I asked Soli and relate to them, please.
Firstly, you hear me now, right? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so firstly, thank you for having me. I'm really flattered to join this distinguished panel for this important discussion, which is so dear to me. I'd like to start by sharing my postulation that in any assessment we try to make regarding Turkey and Israel, in any equation we try to form, there should be two constants, Netanyahu and Erdogan. As far as I can see, under the current circumstances, these two are here to stay. None of them is going to peacefully transfer the governing power he withholds. So it all sums to the personal relations between these two, Netanyahu and Erdogan. And if we are to discuss future bilateral relations between Turkey and Israel, I'm not sure that this is a bad assumption. And another coefficient that must be added to this equation is emotions. Both Netanyahu and Erdogan are driven by emotions when it gets to the bilateral relations with each other. Yet Erdogan immensely surpasses Netanyahu, especially when it gets to the suffering of the Palestinians in Gaza. I see things from here and from the times I used to visit Turkey a bit different to many of my colleagues, and I beg to claim that as I see it, Erdogan's reactions to the situation in Gaza since the 1-minute incident in Davos, at least, are more than mere political tool. To my humble assessment, they are based on deep and sincere religious identifications that immerses him with sincere emotional involvement. He thinks I think he generally identifies with the Palestinian suffering in general and with Hamas in particular, based on the common aspirations and the spirit of the Muslim Brotherhood, which the AKP shares with Hamas. And as we all know, emotions are bad advisors, not to say bad drivers for diplomacy. And since Hamas' heinous attack of October 7th on Israel, apart from this phone call to Herzog, his emotions led him to make the wrong assessment in every turn of events. A few examples. Initially, Erdogan assessed that Netanyahu's days are over, so it seems. So he started to attack Netanyahu personally, not Israel in general, thinking that in this way it will enable him to keep the benefits of the economic deals they struck in this meeting you all referred to in September in Turkey House in Manhattan, and yet gain sympathy. He did seek at home, yes, politically, and among Hamas in general. When the families of the Israelis kidnapped by Hamas from the home sent him a personal letter by a messenger, pleading him to use his good relations with Hamas to help strike a deal that will bring the release of the loved ones, he leaked it to Hande Firat, our friend from CNN, claiming it is a proof of Netanyahu's weakness, domestic and international. The fact that he approached him proves that, so he was quoted. Then he was overwhelmed with frustration because Israel didn't allow Turkish Air Force planes to drop humanitarian aid onto Gaza, like so many other countries were allowed to do. So he further deteriorated his language against Netanyahu. When he assessed that a ceasefire agreement is imminent, he banned all trade with Israel until ceasefire is reached. And I'm sure he thought that it is a matter of days that this ceasefire that Hamas agreed to is about to be reached. And again, it was the wrong assessment, emotionally driven, that led to further deterioration in the language he uses against Netanyahu. Netanyahu, on the other hand, has too many fronts on his agenda currently. His reaction to Erdogan attacks his reactions are disproportional, or should I say inversely proportional, disproportional to Erdogan's attacks. He once tweeted in response, mentioning the Armenian genocide in a clear intention to hurt, but that was it. Turkey is not on Netanyahu's agenda. He has other fish to fry at the moment. Israel's Minister of Foreign Affairs, as Soli mentioned, uses his ex-Twitter account to insult Erdogan with dumb, ignorant, unconstructive text and foolish AI-generated images, to the dismay of the professional diplomats in the ministry in Jerusalem. To face his critics, he waves Mr. Katz, our minister, with the vast exposure of these tweets. Millions are watching them. No one takes him seriously here in Israel. Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs does comment from time to time, unnecessarily, to my humble opinion, but they have a base too. Trade between Israel and Turkey did drop about 30% of what it used to be, and it is done through various bypasses to the Turkish embargo, such as trade of cement with the Palestinian Authority, as Soli have mentioned. Israelis in general are upset with Erdogan. They are really upset with him personally. They are disappointed after this last rapprochement, resentful, and even, I'd say, fearful to an extent. I must admit that we in the media get numb to Erdogan's attacking Netanyahu. Much of it much of his language does not even reverberate by the mass media. The threshold became quite high these days. This may be a good sign to my positive prognosis for the bilateral relationship because the Israelis are not exposed to everything. Once the war is over and we will be able to add our equation or add to our equation the resumption of Turkish airline competitive flights from Tel Aviv, I'm sure that the Israelis will be happy to ignore Erdogan and embrace Turkey again. As for the second question, Nimrod, as I said earlier, my prognosis to the bilateral relations is good. I'm actually more optimistic regarding the feasibility of an eventual rapprochement or re-rapprochement than I've ever been before, and some of you know how skeptic I was before. Such an assessment, I must admit, surprises even me, myself. I surprised myself, bearing in mind this skepticism that I had before. But this is, I was skeptic before, mainly because of Erdogan's emotional attachment to Hamas, which proved to be right. Why am I more optimist now? I'll try to substantiate that. I think that nearly a year into the most devastating war Israel ever conducted in Gaza, more than 40,000 Palestinian deaths reported by Hamas at least, nearly 90% of the territory under evacuation orders, lack of sufficient sanitation and hygiene supplies, health services and shelter, according to UN report, social media and Turkish media full of horror stories and accounts of atrocities the Israelis are conducting there. Israel is indicted in the ICJ. There's a request for arrest warrants against Netanyahu in the ICC. And despite all this, the diplomatic relations are intact, not even downgraded. Yes, the Turkish ambassador to Tel Aviv was called for consultations, but the embassy is functioning fully. Even cultural affairs are taking place. The Israeli diplomats were called home because of security considerations, yet as far as I understand, the Turkish Foreign Office has no objection for the ambassador to go back to Ankara. So far, I'd say we are passing the test, nearly flying colors. Even the démarche for the Turkish chargé d'affaires after the embassy in Tel Aviv lowered the flag to half-mast, mourning the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, was in surprisingly low key and not even reported to the press or by the press here in Israel. I've been for a long time big proponent of the gas diplomacy between Israel and Turkey. I believe that once the war is over, we will have to capitalize this £1 million banknote. I'm referring to Mark Twain's story. Israel has in the form of gas in the Mediterranean seabed. Experts say that conveying this gas to Europe via Turkey is the best feasible, if not the only way to cash it. And sooner than later, Israel will desperately need this money and fast. Netanyahu realized it and he understands the consequences. On top of the various gas promises he already received from Netanyahu, Erdogan, as Soli mentioned, is probably looking at the prospects of construction works in the Gaza Strip, both for income, national and personal, since lots of money will be involved, and for influence. Until we reach this stage, it is important, and you referred to that in your question, Nimrod, I think it is more important than ever for civil society organization to fill the void that the business community has left now because the above mentioned wrong decision. This was not the situation before. Before we had an active, vibrant business community. Now we don't have that. So it is for the civil society to come into this void. But when the time will come, it will be for the big conglomerates to take over. They will have to be driven by the politicians in both sides. We'll have no problem to flip over, both of them. As my grandmother used to say in Yiddish, when you need the thief, you cut the hanging rope. In Turkish, it is more descriptive than Izeh Dushem, Yilena Sarılı. Falling into the sea, you will hug a snake. In proper English, any port in a storm. One word, Realpolitik. Thank you.
Thank you, Arad, also for your optimism. I know of your skepticism before, so I'm surprised as well.
I surprise myself every day. I assess the situation. Yes.
And you know, when you speak about civil society and personal civilian interaction, and some of you mentioned the stopping of the flights. Okay, and that's really big because it's not only impacting the way Israelis use the Istanbul airport for connections to other places in the world, because it enabled that free engagement and flow of people that was possible during times of previous political crisis. And now we stop. For us, the people here, the Israelis here, to go to Istanbul now, which was something we were doing quite often, has become much more challenging, not because of the security or political situation, because of practical difficulties of no flights. And I think that's a priority to try and fix. I'm going now from the domestic to the international, and we're speaking now with Dr. Gali Lindenstrauss and Dr. Gidon Tull, and some of you already mentioned a bit of the international agenda and issues that are impacting, but let's take like the big picture look on the regional affairs and the international implications of this crisis between Israel and Turkey, and we can look at it from the perspective of what's happening in Gaza. We can look at it from East Med diplomacy, relations between Israel and Turkey and other countries in the region, Cyprus, that is also relevant to the Gaza issue that Arad mentioned, Egypt, and we've been hearing that there may be another heads of state meeting between Egypt and Turkey. We also can think about the trade limitations and how that involves other countries that are trying to help bypass. So there's quite a number of regional implications for the Turkey-Israeli bilateral crisis that we can look at and try to find over there some perhaps opening to drive things in a better direction. Galia, I will start with you, so please.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today, and to Dr. Gore and Dr. Tull for organizing this important event. So one of the remarkable developments in recent years was the growing cooperation in the Eastern Mediterranean. Yes, in many respects, it was a response to Turkish growing assertiveness in the region, but it also had an organic component of a greater need to cooperate between the regional states on issues ranging from energy to climate change adaptation to security. Israel-Cyprus-Greece relations have also been negatively affected by the war in Gaza. In a sense, all the positive momentum of regional cooperation in Eastern Mediterranean has been stalled. So there's the continuation of existing cooperation frameworks, but no new substance. Still, the sharp deterioration in Turkish-Israeli relations since October 7th has obviously proven the wisdom, actually, of Israel's decision already more than a decade ago to improve relations with Cyprus and Greece. Turkey, as was already mentioned, ordered this May a complete halt on direct trade with Israel. And this has had a substantial effect. Looking at Turkish statistics, even if we include Turkey's trade with the Palestinians, there has been a decrease from $440 million worth of Turkish exports to Israel and the Palestinian Authority, to 60 million Turkish exports to Israel and the Palestinian Authority. So there has been a decline. But some of these products are coming to Israel through Greece. Also, there was mention of flights, and now there's a lot of problems of foreign carriers not flying to Israel. So Athens and Larnaca have proven a substantial hub for stranded Israelis abroad to return home because they have all these cancellations of flights. Beyond that, there have been efforts to use the trust that was built between Israel and Cyprus to promote the humanitarian corridor to Gaza through Cyprus. Unfortunately, the naval pier project in Gaza has failed due to technical issues, but there's still a route going from Cyprus to the Ashdod port and from there to Gaza. So this has proven useful. I don't want too much to talk about the day after, although I'm really happy about Arad Nir's optimism. I was also surprised to see it. And I don't still see how Israel will allow Turkish involvement in the post-war scenarios. But I want to highlight one less known fact about Turkish-Israeli trade relations. They're very much linked, as was already somehow mentioned, to Turkish-Palestinian trade relations. Before the war, 5% of Israeli imports and 18% of Palestinian imports came from Turkey. And usually these imports came on the same ship. Now, the shipments to the Palestinian authorities very much depend on the fact that some of these shipments are later resold to Israeli merchants, hence increasing the trade volume and making all this commercially viable. Without the trade to Israel, this won't work. And Israel was quite close, actually, 10 days ago, to deciding to practically halt this route by imposing a 100% tax on direct imports from Turkey. And this was stopped in the last minute. Hence, even if you look at the reality from Palestinian eyes, a halt in direct Turkish trade with Israel might likely prove counterproductive if Israel does decide in the near future to retaliate in tax measures. In general, I have to emphasize that the Palestinian and Israeli economies are very much linked, and attempts to delink them are ultimately unsuccessful, looking historically, and they harm both communities. So I really hope that Turkey will reverse its decision to halt the trade in Israel, because it also has effects on the Palestinians. Thank you.
Thank you, Galia. I will follow up because one of the questions we already got from the audience relate to Israel-Azerbaijan relations, and I know that's something that you've been following, whether that's some kind of a substitute or kind of a safe zone for Israel-Turkey relations to continue indirectly through a country that is in good terms with each of them. And as you try to answer that, maybe also look at which international entities, organizations, countries can pitch in and play a role to support the movement of ties between Israel and Turkey, if not now, then after things in Gaza quiet down a bit.
So we know after the previous crisis in Turkish-Israeli relations in 2018, Azerbaijan did try to mediate between Israel and Turkey, and and some say that the rapprochement in 2022 did relate to some of these Azerbaijani efforts. As mentioned here, Israel gets quite a substantial amount of its oil from Azerbaijan, but this is important for Azerbaijan. It's also important for Turkey for the transit fee. So obviously this is not a comfortable situation for Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan would want things to change. I would, however, be cautious in giving too much of a role to Azerbaijan. I think the key actor here is the US. In late April, we saw that the US efforts were probably behind the scenes and probably successful in halting a new flotilla that was set to sail to Gaza. And they managed to stop it. And of course, nobody wants to see a repetition of what happened in 2010. And hence, I understand the US priorities. And I'm very grateful to the Biden administration for many things and also for this. But I would say the fact that we don't see US pressure on Turkey to resume trade relations with Israel, I think it's concerning. Trade is not a luxury, okay? It helps maintain actors who have a vested interest in continuation of relations. Another actor I would pay attention to is probably the Arab Gulf states. They also have interest in keeping Turkish-Israeli relations in a reasonable condition. An extreme position of Turkey vis-a-vis Israel only encourages extremism and puts on the regime's domestic pressures, and that's not to their benefits. And they can tie their improved economic cooperation with Turkey on pressures in this respect. And lastly, because we put all this emphasis on civil society, again, I want to point back to the business community that was affected from the halt of trade between Turkey and Israel, and also to pressures on the Jewish community in Turkey and on people with dual Turkish-Israeli citizenship. All these people, these business people, the Jewish people, they were an important bridge in the bilateral relationship. And I think Turkey has moved one step too far and in burning these bridges, and whatever can still be maintained should be maintained. Thank you.
Thank you, Galia. Gurnur, over to you. Same questions.
Well, thank you, Nimrod. Much of what I was planning to say has been already said, but one thing that we didn't mention, and this is in the context of implications of this tension between Turkey and Israel. One thing that hasn't mentioned is NATO's cooperation with Israel. Turkey has blocked cooperation between NATO and Israel since October, and that includes joint meetings and exercises. And Erdogan said the alliance should not engage Israel as a partner until there is an end to the conflict. As you know, Israel carries the status of NATO partner and has been working very closely with the military alliance. One such platforms that Israel contributes to, which is important for the region, is the Mediterranean Dialogue. MD is it's a partnership forum that the goal of which is to contribute to security and stability in the wider Mediterranean region, and Israel is part of that. So there are several other regional partners as well, and these MD partners, they share expertise, they share best practices and knowledge with NATO in preventing and countering violent extremism, for example, or the protection of critical energy infrastructure, missile defense and cybersecurity. So these are just a few areas that these partners focus on. And obviously, these exchanges are very critical to enhancing the shared understanding of threats, and there are 1,000 such activities that are available to NATO MD partners. Israel also participates and contributes to various, not Israel, but other MD partners contribute to various NATO activities that are very critical for Turkey as well. So the fact that Erdogan has vetoed NATO engagement with Israel will have implications on that front. And the second is, this has been said previously, this tension between Erdogan and Netanyahu could also derail this possible joint Israeli-Turkish exploration of natural gas in the Eastern Mediterranean, and also pipeline construction. As you know, Israel discovered natural gas off its coast in 2010, and one of the regions that Israel wants to sell its gas to is Europe. And the most economically viable way to get Israeli gas to Europe is through Turkey, and both countries stand to gain from that. And that was one of the reasons why actually Erdogan decided to mend ties with Israel from the previous 2010 rupture. And in 2022, I believe Turkey, after Turkey-Israel normalization, Israel shelved discussions with Greece and Cyprus about building an Eastern Mediterranean pipeline. And now, given where relationship stands, Israel can revive those talks. And in fact, it's become a necessity for Israel, given the problems in the energy market and the uncertainty over what's going to happen to Russian energy. It's important for European countries to have access to Middle Eastern energy. So Israel has a lot of natural gas reserves, and it is, despite the war that's raging on, Israel is still pressing forward with natural gas development. Recently, it awarded 12 licenses to 6 companies, for example. And I think also, Galia mentioned this, we can expect resumption of talks with this between Israel and Greece and Cyprus, because these 2 countries have also proved to be important partners to Israel since October 7th. If you remember the pro-Israel stance Greece took in the regional summit in Cairo, for instance, it was important. It was one of the reasons why Arabs did not get what they wanted from the summit. Or another area of cooperation is Israeli national carriers were able to shuttle between Israel's ports and airports to neighboring Cypriot and also Greek ports. So you could expect the resumption of those talks, which Erdogan will not be happy about. And the final thing is that could have implications. Again, this was mentioned, Gaza reconstruction. There is nothing Erdogan likes more than construction, right? To him, any war or a natural disaster is an opportunity to line the pockets of his allies in the construction sector. So that's why he has long wanted to play a role in the reconstruction of Gaza. But obviously now that has become problematic. But I don't really rule that out entirely, a potential Turkish role, because the UN says it will take 80 years to rebuild Gaza. So I can imagine a future where either Erdogan is not there anymore, where Turkey can actually play that role. And in terms of which actor can help these two countries mend ties, I agree with Ambassador Satterfield. It's Erdogan. Galia talked about business communities and Gulf countries. Yes, they have potential to play a role, but it's ultimately up to Erdogan. And let's remember what prompted Erdogan to repair ties with Israel after the previous rupture, right? After the flotilla incident in 2010. So several factors. One, Turkey's economic problems. And that was made clear by 2019 election results, where Erdogan's ruling party lost all major cities to the opposition. And one of the top reasons for that loss was the country's dire economic circumstances. So that was one of the reasons why Erdogan wanted to repair diplomatic ties with Israel, along with Saudis, the UAE, and Washington, after many years of problematic relationships. And the second reason, Erdogan was uncomfortable with the growing anti-Turkey camp in the East Med that included Greece, Cyprus, Israel, and Egypt. So for him, mending ties with Israel was a way of inserting Turkey into the equation again. And the third, Erdogan wanted to buy F-16s from Washington, and he thought that the Israeli lobby in Washington could help him, as it did in the 1990s. So these three factors played a role in Erdogan's decision-making. And that could still happen, I think. And despite Erdogan's strong words following October 7th, I think he had somewhat a measured response in a way. And Arad talked about this. He really thought, he focused his criticism on Netanyahu, because I really thought that Erdogan thought Netanyahu was going to be brought down by his own people. So that's why he limited his criticism. He didn't direct his criticism at Israeli society or bureaucracy in general, but specifically at Netanyahu. And in the way he responded also, he was measured. For a long time after October 7th, Turkey continued to do business trade with Israel, including Erdogan's son. Several well-respected Turkish reporters say that Erdogan's son was still doing business with Israel after October 7th. And even when he finally declared a total ban on trade, as was mentioned, Azeri oil is still flowing through Turkey and through Greece. So I think his way of looking at this, he doesn't, and also consider the fact that Turkey blocked a Gaza-bound 8 flotilla from sailing. So all these things tell us that Erdogan wants to be a lot more measured, because he knows what it means. After his stance, post-2010 stance, it really hurt Turkey economically and diplomatically in various theaters. So he doesn't want a repeat of that. That's why I think he's measured. And that's why I think what we see in Turkey-Israel ties right now is not irreversible. And if I may, I would like to say a few things about what Soylu Hoca said on the domestic situation and public's view of what's happening in Gaza and Israel. Turkey has always been, pro-Palestinian sentiment has always been very strong in Turkey. But I think the uprising, the civil war in Syria changed that a bit, not dramatically, but I think now Turkish society is less pro-Palestinian than it used to be. for reasons that are not directly related to the Palestinians, but to what has happened in Syria. Right now, there's a large Syrian community in Turkey, millions of them. And I remember right after the October 7th attacks happened, there was a lot of talk in Turkish media and fear that Erdogan had cut a deal that would allow people from Gaza, thousands of them, to go to Turkey. And particularly the opposition parties were very critical of that. So they just don't want a large group of what they call Arabs. They already have this national sentiment against Arabs is very strong. That's one reason. And also there is this sense, particularly among opposition parties, that Turkey with Syria, Turkey got involved in Arab affairs way too much. And they don't really want Turkey to make the same mistake. So there is this kind of distance. Obviously, the populist, I mean, there's, again, they play to the pro-Palestinian sentiment, but I think the opposition stance is also somewhat measured in that regard. And I'll end it there.
Thank you very much, Gunul. We'll give a chance for a final round in which you could relate to things that have been voiced by others on different topics. But before we do that, I would also like to put into play the few questions that we still have open. One of them follows up on the reference to Turkey and NATO and looking at Turkey's position on other NATO expansion issues, whether that's also a reason because of domestic politics. We have a question about what could be spilling over from one government to another. So we spoke a lot about personalities in this conversation, about Erdogan, about Netanyahu. Is it a personal issue, or is it something much more structural, systematic, when we talk about other crises or opportunities in Israel-Turkey relations? And we had a question about, some future outlook about American politics. If Trump comes into office, what will it mean? We can ask the same question about future possible President Kamala Harris. Abraham Accord countries were also asked about, but we related a bit to the role of the Gulf. So those are the open questions that we have. Feel free to address any of those that you would like, or to relate to things that have been voiced by others. And on the final word, if you want to indicate either some initiative or cooperation that you see continuing between Israelis and Turks to emphasize this resilience of ties that was specified, please do that, or let us know what you think could be done by people caring about these relations tomorrow to move things forward. Just a suggestion. I will start with Ambassador Satterfield. Floor is yours. Please keep it to 2-3 minutes each so we can conclude in time.
Thank you, Nimrod. Of course, I share, in a long-term sense, Arad's not optimism, but expectation of calming in this relationship because of the fundamental elements, strategic and transactional both, that bring both sides over time together. Gerner's description of past behaviors is absolutely on the mark in terms of how Erdogan has approached the dramatic change in the last 2 years of relations with Egypt, with the UAE, with Israel as well, based upon self-interest, driven by a fundamental concern for the economy, upon which his political power and ultimate survival in politics depends. Those are rational factors. They're pragmatic factors. And despite emotion, I believe they will over time prevail. On the Israeli side, there are similar compelling transactional and strategic factors which predate the current Israeli government and go back to Ben-Gurion and his theory of relationships beyond the immediate circle of Arab states. Turkey is important to Israel. Israel is, as Gerner has said, important to Turkey in that instrumentalized sense. So I think we can see an improvement over time, but in the immediate space, the important thing is to do what we can to calm, not to inflame, to underscore fundamental relationships, Turkey's role in NATO, which the US and the other NATO partners value highly, the extraordinary warming with Greece and in the Aegean, which needs to be sustained. That's a very important development. And just a word on the Eastern Med. Gas is indeed an enduring commodity, which does need a distributive route to Europe. I don't think a pipeline makes sense anymore economically, but shipborne landings to Ceyhan and from there into Europe is certainly a part of an Eastern Med picture. And frankly, I see the Eastern Med functioning in a far more pragmatic and less polarized fashion vis-a-vis an alliance against Turkey than was the case for many, many years. The Eastern Med pipeline never had a real-world life. It doesn't have a real-world life now. It is technically and economically completely unfeasible, so I don't see a return to that as a stick with which to beat Turkey. So all in all, calming measures, strategic patience, and continued engagement is the way ahead.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Solly, please.
Briefly, I'm not convinced that the sympathy for the Palestinians is gone. Sympathy for Hamas, if it existed at the level that the government thought it did, is gone, in my view. Comparing Turkish resistance and war of independence to what Hamas does did not really wash well for a majority of the Turkish public, as far as I'm concerned. So in terms of domestic politics, yes, Erdogan can, first of all, as I said, the rhetoric is calmer now, and he can play his games rather easily. But the opposition will also put pressure. I think the opposition leader is trying to go to Ramallah to meet with Mahmoud Abbas himself as well. We did not mention a word or a country in this talk. That's Iran. Turkey is as concerned as everybody else about Iranian role in the politics of the region. It's just not as hysterical as some others. So that is one way, and that I think is the strategic link between Turkey and Gulf countries, as well as Turkey and Israel, and that may be a way to start rebuilding relations when waters calm down. Finally, if domestic conditions and the public sentiment are important, then there's got to be some light at the end of a tunnel about a ceasefire, and also what the Saudis also, I understand, put as one their condition to open diplomatic relations with Israel, and that is a path, a reliable or a reasonable or an acceptable path to some kind of Palestinian state or its Palestinian self-determination. That will definitely have a good impact on Turkish public opinion as well as public opinion elsewhere, I think.
Thank you for that, Solly. Arad, would you like to put some closing words? You're muted, Arad.
Well, I learned that one day. I'd like to add a few pieces of information, and relates to one of the questions that we were asked in the chat. So pieces of information. I think and I know that even within the Erdoganic circles, they are trying to convince the Israelis to direct their resentment to him. They're trying to plant articles in various Israeli English newspapers attacking. They plant articles that attack Erdogan's entourage. I think there is a tendency over there that they think of the day after, and they try to lower the flames. Even the comments from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs after the Chargé d'Affaires here was called for the démarche. The ministry in Ankara called Israel. They asked the MFA to summon the Israeli ambassador, who is in Israel now, to a reciprocal demarche. How would they do it? They did it by phone. It wasn't even published in Israeli media. I don't think it was published in Turkish media. My editors didn't find it worthwhile. Didn't pass the threshold I was referring to earlier. And as for the question about Trump and or Harris, outcome of American elections, I think that Netanyahu, Trump, and Erdogan can make good bunch together. They are the same. Netanyahu is trying to be like Erdogan. That's his model. That's where that's the amount of power he wants to achieve. And Trump likes authoritarian rulers. And I don't, and in Israel, the current government and Netanyahu in particular is really hoping for Trump to come back. I think that if Harris will get into the White House, it will be a total different story. But if Trump will get there, he doesn't care about human rights or anything like that.
Thank you, Arad. Galia?
I agree with what was said here, that the deterioration in Turkish-Israeli relations was not so much because Turkey is pro-Palestinian or the Turkish public is pro-Palestinian. It was more the issue of Turkey being pro-Hamas and Erdogan being pro-Hamas and really hosting Hamas publicly and very closely. And these images were very hurtful from the Israeli standpoint after what occurred in October 7th. And I think here I agree with Professor Ozel that the assassination of Haniyeh and the fact that Turkey has its relations with Sinwar are not so good, and the re-entrance of the Palestinian Authority, that may be good news also for Turkish-Israeli relations. I also have to emphasize that as Turkey suffered so much from terror and Israel suffered so much from terror, I read, for example, about PKK tunnels in northern Iraq, and it really sounds very similar to what we're experiencing in Gaza. The way warfare is going, the terror organizations, they don't have to win, they just have to survive, and they're building all these tunnels underneath civilian population. These are challenges that both societies will have to deal with, and so that again, I think there might be more understanding to what Israel is undertaking in Gaza. However, I would be less optimistic than some of the voices heard here. I think the issue is not only Netanyahu. It's the move of the Israeli public to the right. And the events of October 7th have only made this trend that was already existing before, it only made it worse. The Israelis are very skeptical of any peace process, of any withdrawals, of anything given to the Palestinians. And this might change. Again, maybe we haven't reached the lowest point. Maybe we're going to get to the hurting stalemate, hurting point that both societies will change. But currently, if the war stops now, if ceasefire is tomorrow morning, the Israeli public is very reluctant to move to a peace process, and that will create tensions in the future in Turkish-Israeli relations.
Thank you. Leonor.
I second what Soli said about the ceasefire. I think a ceasefire in Gaza would certainly put things back on track. Erdogan is more than willing to do that, I think. I know he doesn't sound like that, but this is a time when Erdogan is trying to fix Turkish economy, and hence he's trying to mend ties with everyone. So he understands that. And there's a question about what role can Turkey's efforts to normalize ties with Turkey play in Turkey's rapprochement. And there's a mention of how Erdogan wants to curb the influence of Iranian proxies in Syria. I don't think Turkey sees Israel as a critical partner there. If anything, Erdogan would like to work with Iran because he is really interested in normalizing ties with Assad, again, for domestic reasons. And that calls for working with Assad's allies, including Russia, which Turkey is already doing, and also Iran. So I don't think that plays a critical role.
Thank you. We've reached the end of our conversations. I would like to thank first of you to all of the speakers and really for sharing your insights, expertise, outlook for the future, even optimism. I think that's really important in such discussion. I think we showcase the importance of maintaining dialogue between Israelis and Turks. Much of this dialogue is happening even these days behind closed doors, or at least some of it is becoming public. I think bringing in the American dimension into such conversation is also of importance to the local actors. And also, as we see the issues of pragmatism and resilience and shared interest, also to look at the fact that it's not only about the politicians, about the strategic interests. We are talking about people in both countries who are fighting for values that are not always represented within their leadership, and the international partnership or the bilateral partnership that they can form with each other, facing similar challenges, I think can be powerful. We saw that in Israel last year before the war, when Israel was fighting the judicial overhaul, and so many insights were brought from Turkey, from Hungary, from Poland, from allies, pro-democracy allies over there. I think that's an important component to keep in mind as well. There are still many questions coming, and it means that we need to continue the conversation and talk about this issue again. So again, thank you to the speaker, thank you to the audience. You are welcome to go to MEI's website and see many of the pieces that were written about Israel, about Turkey, about other regional affairs.